So, have you all been enjoying the Urusei Yatsura remake anime? I certainly have, but it made me wonder, how does this remake hold up to the original 80s anime, as well as to the original manga? So I started comparing the three, and I came to some very startling conclusions. Wanna know what they are? Let's have a look together. So as stated, I've been having a great time with the anime remake of Urusei Yatsura, and I'm so happy to see the series receive all the attention and love it's been getting. But there was no doubt in my mind that the best anime adaptation was the one from the 80s. And since it's been a while since I've watched that version of the anime, I thought, why not take out my Blu-rays and compare the manga with the 80s anime and with this remake. And actually the conclusions were not the ones I was expecting to have. So let's have a look together and break it all down. Okay, in order to do this comparison, I'm gonna put some scans of the manga in the middle of the screen. On the left side, I'll put screenshots of the 80s anime, and on the right side, I'll put some screenshots of the remake version. And then we can really compare and see which is more faithful or in which way they have adapted the story. So without further ado, let's get started, and we're going to start with the first chapter in the manga, because I'm going to use the manga as the main story thread throughout this comparison, because not all anime follow the exact same order as the stories as they appeared in the manga. So let's have a look. First part or story is Kakemeguru Seishun, which means our fleeting youth, I would translate it a bit freely. And this is actually the story where we meet our main characters, Ataru, Shinobu, Lum of course, Cherry, and many other characters. So a couple of panels from the manga here. So first scene, we start with a lover's quarrel between Ataru and Shinobu. So Shinobu is again apparently fed up with the fact that Ataru looks at other girls, she slaps him, runs off, and then he's left there pondering his life, his love life, while looking over the river from high atop the bridge. We then see that Cherry comes running along, shouting that he's going to save him, but instead he accidentally pushes him into the river. He gets out of the river. Cherry tells him that a great evil or a lot of bad luck will befall him if he keeps going on the path that he is going, mainly in this case going home. And well, since Ataru says, whatever the hell you're saying, I'm just going to go home. So Cherry decides to accompany him to his home, and when they arrive there, they see a large group of people gathered around Ataru's house, or the house of his parents actually. And from there then we will see that this is because the Oni, or the invaders, have arrived there. So lover's quarrel, introduction of Cherry, and then moving on, Ataru and Cherry together to Ataru's house. Now, if we have a look at how the 80s anime went about it, in episode 1, we already see a couple of differences. First important difference is there's no lover's quarrel between Ataru and Shinobu to begin with. And that's actually quite interesting. Ataru does get hit in the head, but it's with a baseball ball. There are some kids playing baseball. The ball gets hit out of the park, as they say, and hits him right in the face. And that's the moment that Cherry arrives, and we don't have any interaction here with Shinobu. Later, a little bit later in the scenes, we see that some mysterious-looking people arrive. Later, we will learn that they are government people. You can see them here in the car with Ataru. So they come to find him, and they want to escort him home. So they take him with their car home. As he arrives home, he gets in, and Shinobu is waiting there for him. So they take each other in their arms, and there's no lover's quarrel there yet. So a couple of big differences. We don't have the lover's quarrel to start. Shinobu gets introduced later, and it's not Cherry and Ataru that go to Ataru's house. He is being escorted by these mysterious government people. Interestingly, they introduce the spaceship of the Oni at that time, after we arrive at Ataru's house, and which we don't see in the manga yet, and they are shaped in a triangular shape with like I would say a tube-like shape attached to it, almost spear-like, with a tiger pattern covering the entire hull. So this is the design of the spaceship, and we see it earlier than in the manga. Keep in mind the design of the spaceship. This will come up later as we continue. Now, if you have a look at the remake, how they went about it, they start up with the spaceships. We see the spaceships, and you had the Big Ben clock tower in London, very symbolic at the very first scene. And we see the spaceship of the Oni, of the invaders, hanging over various major cities in the world, including Japan as well. And what's interesting is they don't start with Shinobu and Ataru, they start with establishing the threat. And it gives it a little bit more of a cinematic feeling, I would say. Now, we often have that in Hollywood movies where they start with a threat and then, especially for grand space opera or grand science fiction movies, and then we are introduced to the main characters. This is a bit the vibe they were going for here. So they start with introducing the Oni, the threat, and it's only then that we get an exact reproduction of the manga, where we see Shinobu and Ataru having their lovers' quarrel, exactly as it happened in the manga. You see here a screenshot of Ataru still recovering from the slap he got on the face, standing atop the same bridge, pondering about what happened. The same exact thing happens as in the manga. Cherry arrives, he falls in the river, he gets out. Then you have the discussion between them, those two, where Cherry explains that a lot of bad luck will befall him if he continues down his path. The way they get to Ataru's house then is also different here. Instead, we don't have the same version as in the manga, but we also don't have the same version as in the 80s. He's being all of a sudden surrounded and escorted by a bunch of men in black. And I purposely call them men in black because I do believe that this is a little wink and nod by the animation studio here. They're all dressed in black suits with dark sunglasses, with the earpieces. It does look a bit like the Men in Black, and we have space invaders here. The Oni are actually space invaders, so Men in Black, space invaders. That I think that's a little nod or a little wink to that part of American culture. So if I take this first panel here as a whole, both anime have their own take on the events that happen, but I would have to say, and I was surprised because I had expected the opposite, but I would have to say that the remake is actually closer to the manga at this point than the 80s anime, because we have the whole lovers quarrel, we have the scene with Cherry, and they changed a lot more in the 80s version. Continuing on, then we have, of course, the discussion inside Ataru's house with the Oni leader, talking about the competition that's going to take place, the Onigoko game, where the tag, Urit game, where Ataru will have to catch Lum's horns within a certain amount of days. He held the discussion here in the manga. Present inside the house is Ataru, Shinobu, his family, Cherry, and a bunch of reporters, and of course the Oni. And then we see his opponent, Lum, arrive. She arrives here on the scene with a lightning flash, and then she leans against the open fusuma, the open sliding door. Ataru being overjoyed that he's going to have to grab hold of such a beautiful lady. And after everybody has left, and the stage is set for the competition, so to speak, we then see that there's a discussion between Ataru, Cherry, and Ataru's parents, digging deeper into the fact that, do you have any idea, kokoro no atari arimasu ka? Asks Cherry, meaning, do you have any idea, do you have any hint as to why your son would be the avatar, the epitome of bad luck. And then you see indeed Ataru's parents going on and discussing about, oh, yeah, he was born on Friday the 13th. Oh yeah, I remember his name, according to Buddhism, was very bad luck. And here I have to make a little side note. I think it's always interesting to make a little cultural note here. In Japan, when parents give a name to their child, whether it be a boy or a girl, of course the family name is a given. That's the same family name as the father, but the first name they can choose, and Japanese names are written with kanji, with characters, and each character has a stroke count. What does that mean? When they write with a pencil, you have a number of strokes in order to write that character. So they count those number of strokes, and then they look at the Buddhist calendar to see if that number is good or bad fortune. And if it's bad fortune, it is not unheard of, and actually it's a common practice, I would say, that parents will choose another name simply because the number of strokes in the first name that they were thinking of giving the child would mean it has bad luck according to Japanese Buddhism. And that's here what Ataru's father is talking about when he says, yeah, if I remember correctly, the stroke numbers or his name was rather bad luck according to Buddhist faith. So that's a bit of superstition in Japan, very much still alive to this day. And yeah, it's fun that we can read that here in the manga. What does the 80s anime do? Well, they have the same discussion here. So we have the Oni leader, Lum's father, having the whole discussion. Shinobu is a little bit more visibly present, I would say. And then, of course, you have these people that escorted Ataru to his house, those mysterious people from the government. How would I say, introduce the Oni and leading towards the discussion of the game that is going to take place, leading to believe that they were already informed of the matter and they were talking to Ataru about what's going on here, that he was selected as Earth's champion. Lum arrives, not with a lightning flash, and he's taking a rather, well, I would say a rather sexy pose there, but not exactly the same one as in the manga. And then later, after the whole discussion is done, the floorboard, the tatami of the room is being lifted, and then you have all the reporters jumping out and asking questions and so on. So we have the reporters there, but a lot later and in a different fashion than we have them in the manga. The discussion about why Ataru would be the avatar of bad luck doesn't happen here. So when something doesn't happen, I put a blue X mark, means that doesn't exist here in this part of the anime. The remake then, what do we have here? A bit similar, so we have the whole discussion here. One notable difference, of course, is that the men in black are there instead of those other men in the 80s. And the Oni leader, Lum's father, has some henchmen with him. That's an addition they did for the remake. In a sense, I don't dislike that, because I think it would stand to reason that the leader of an alien invader force would have some henchmen with him when he's going to talk with the people he's planning to invade. So in a sense, I think that's a nice addition. It works well. I don't have an issue with that. And the arrival of Lum, very interestingly, is exactly as it happens in the manga. Lightning flash. She enters through the open sliding door, the fusuma, and she leans against it exactly as we see it in the manga here. I find that fascinating. They clearly went back to the source material here. They clearly went back to the manga. And you see she's taking up the exact same pose, zoomed in a little bit more. And that's something I'm going to be talking about as well. You often have the exact same scene, but with a different camera angle, or zoomed in or zoomed out. And that is a conscious choice by the animators, I believe, because in a manga, you only have a certain number of panels per page, and you need to transmit that story within that capacity. So here, for example, Takahashi Sensei, the author, had a drawing with Lum leaning against the open door, and Shinobu and Ataru already talking about how he's happy that he's going to be able to grab such a pretty girl. In animated form, you can cut from one scene to the next more easily, and you don't need to cram all that information into one shot necessarily. So that gives a little bit more freedom to the animators, and I think it's great that they chose to go this way. They focus on Lum, but with the exact same pose, leaning against the sliding door as she did in the original manga. Great that they add that extra bit of fidelity to that adaptation. The discussion with Cherry about Ataru being the avatar of bad luck doesn't happen here as well. Moving on. Then we have the competition in and of itself. So at the start we see Ataru and Lum getting ready at the starting line. There's not a lot of detail in the manga panel here. The only thing I would say is that to me it looks like a track and field kind of a situation. So I don't think it doesn't look like actually an actual stadium. It also doesn't look like just a normal street. I think it's something like track and field, and from there they start and then they move into the streets. Interesting to note, so Ataru is stretching, Lum is just standing there getting ready, and a little wink again by Takahashi sensei. She's really great at adding those little tidbits of fun and little jokes or winks and nods. A black cat passing by, again signifying the fact that Ataru really attracts bad luck. The competition starts. We have reporters reporting how the match is evolving. And here again, great humor by Takahashi sensei. So we have a Japanese reporter who comments exactly on the events as they unfold. But we also have a Chinese and an English-speaking international reporter. And they're just talking nonsense. For example, the English one is saying, this is a pen. I'm a boy. I love you. So all exclamations that don't have anything to do with what's going on. But I think it's a little bit of humor from her side. She probably doesn't speak all that well English or Chinese for that matter. And I suppose, I can't understand it, but I suppose the Chinese is also a bunch of nonsense she put in there that she just happened to look up somewhere. So a little bit of humor there. I really like that. And then after the first day of the competition is done, then we go to, in the evening, we go to Ataru's room, and there we have Cherry, Ataru, Shinobu having a discussion about the events that are unfolding. So that's what we have in the manga. Let's see in the 80s anime. So here also we have the warming up session. You see Ataru's leg where he's stretching. We see Lum jumping up and down. We don't have that in the manga. There she's more standing there. But very similar, I would say. It's more clearly a public road where they're starting, whereas in the manga, that isn't exactly the case, I would say. I get the impression, as I said, that it's more like a track and field where they start. But all in all, relatively well adaptation, relatively faithful, I would say. The competition itself, then here they deviate from the manga. In the manga, he's trying to grab hold of her. She runs away. Eventually, she flies away. In the anime, we have that as well, but then we have Ataru trying out all kinds of attributes, I would say, trying roller skate and whatnot, constantly having accidents with each of the attributes that he uses. We don't have that in the manga. That's something they added in the anime here. And here you see him being carried off because one of his schemes failed again. So the attribute aspect will come back. That doesn't exist in the manga, but they did add that in the 80s anime. The discussion then at the end of the day in his room takes place, but big difference here. We don't have Cherry present, and there's a reason for that. It's just Ataru and Shinobu. And that's because here, as he looks out of the window, a bit with a serious, sad face, like he's not going to be able to make it. Here, Shinobu cheers him up and promises to marry him if he succeeds, if he wins. So that scene is not there in the manga yet. So they moved it up earlier and they put it here. Whereas in the manga, there's no talk about that yet. And Cherry is present there. So interesting difference here. They, in a sense, mash two scenes together and change it in a way that we get that discussion earlier. So how does the remake go about it? Well, here we also have the start and the stretching scene. And what I really like is they made it a little bit more cinematic. We see Ataru from a distance clearly stretching, focus on him. The camera pans, the focus moves from him in the distance to Lum's legs that come into the shot. Very well done, very cinematic, and it's a different way to convey exactly the same scene as we have seen, I would say, in the manga and in the 80s anime, but again, a more cinematic vibe, a more cinematic feeling. I think the animators and the director really did a good job in reinterpreting those scenes, but in a more dynamic, in a more modern way, while staying faithful to the original. Here also, so in the manga, from the get-go, we see the reporters with their nonsense that they're, at least the international ones, with the nonsense they're spewing. In the anime, we don't see that, but at the end of the day, as the sun is setting, and very nice shading on the hair of Lum here with the setting sun, here we see Ataru surrounded by reporters asking him about the day's events, trying to get an interview from him. That makes sense in my opinion. You have the whole day, the competition, the day comes to a close. What would reporters want to do? Well, they would want to try to get an interview from the main participant, in this case Ataru. So I think that makes sense, and it's a nice little adaptation, I would say, or little twist they give on what happened in the manga, but pretty close. He doesn't use any attributes like he did in the 80s manga, so it's just him running and trying to grab hold of Lum. So in that sense, more faithful than the 80s anime, again, I have to say. The discussion then in Ataru's room doesn't happen, and here instead, now we have the discussion that they skipped earlier. So remember, earlier in the manga there was a discussion with Ataru's parents, Cherry and Ataru, about why he attracts so much bad luck, why he is the avatar of bad luck. Well, that discussion takes place here. So they stay faithful to the anime, to the manga I mean, but they moved around certain scenes, probably because it adds for a better organic flow in the animated version. So all in all, both anime did a great job. It's just a different take on the source material. Okay, so then in the manga, next day, Ataru manages to grab hold of Lum's bra. She gets upset, knocks him back, and flies off into her spaceship. Interesting to note, first time we see the invader's spaceship in the manga here. And look at the shape. We're gonna get back to that. Later that evening, she visits him through the window in his room, trying to get back her bra. She fails. Reporters are standing around his house, taking pictures of her as she flies off. She's really irritated. And then the competition continues for the next several days with her topless running away and Ataru trying to grab hold of her. He falls from a roof from not all that much of a height. And then you see him being carried off with a tanker and people booing him and saying, "What the hell are you doing, man? Is that all you're capable of? Is that it? Are you hurt?" Things like that. But quite a fun story, a fun way to show the continuation of the competition, I would say. In the 80s manga, we don't have this. They don't have those succession of days, and the bra isn't taken off yet. Same here in the remake. So here, both anime versions cut out a part of the manga succession of events. But what I want to point out here is that the Oni spaceship, as we can see in this manga panel, was introduced at the very beginning of episode 1 in the remake. It's incredibly faithful. Look at that shape, look at that patterning on it, very close. Even the cockpit with the little round shapes in it, very faithfully reproduced in the anime. So here, the remake is also more faithful to the spaceship design than the 80s anime was, because remember, there we had that triangular shaped ship. So interesting to note here. The next evening then, the last evening before the final day of the competition takes place, here we have Ataru really down, lying in his bed, very depressed. His two friends from school and Shinobu present, talking about, trying to cheer him up, trying to revitalize him. It fails. And this is the point in the manga where Shinobu promises to marry him if he succeeds. And that's why here we see him standing out of the window, fist held high, reinvigorated, and then you see his friend saying, wow, is that all it took to revitalize him? Shinobu promising to marry him. So we have this succession of events here. In the 80s anime, what did we get there? None of this. None of this, because indeed the marriage proposal, if I can call it that, happened much earlier. They used another scene, smashed it all together, and or fused the two scenes in a certain way, and they already did that earlier in the episode, so we don't get this. In the remake, we do get this. What do we have here? Shot for shot, and I think this is amazing, shot for shot the same scene. We have Ataru lying in his futon, his two friends from school sitting exactly in the same way next to him, and Shinobu as well, exactly the same pose. What did they change? The camera angle. And they did a great job with that, I think. In the manga, as I said, you're sometimes a little bit more limited with your camera angles and so on. In animated form, you can be much more dynamic about that. You can change camera angles. You can be a little bit more creative with that. And this is exactly what they did. They took the exact same scene, but just from a different camera angle. Fantastic job. Great way to honor the original and to still stay faithful while giving it your own kind of flavor. Same thing with the next shot. Exactly the same. It's almost picture for picture, exactly the same thing. Look at the posing, look at where his friends are. It's an exact reproduction of what we saw in the manga here. A little bit more detail in the room, different clothes, but for the rest, exactly reproduced as we saw it in the manga. I love that. I think they did a great job there. The adaptation is very well done, the quality is very good, and they managed to, with this changing camera angles, to give it a little bit of an extra feeling. Next up, then we have the final competition day. In the manga, Ataru manages to grab hold of Lum as he is using her bra as bait. Here, actually, I have to go back because it's only here that he... Yeah, here he takes out the bra, that's right, sorry. Here he takes out the bra, dangles it in front of her, she catches it, or grabs it, and he uses that momentum to slam her to the ground and grabs her horns. While doing so, he's constantly yelling, "Kekkon shitai, kekkon shitai, kekkon suru no da. I'm gonna get married, I'm gonna get married." Thinking of Shinobu, of course, and that's the whole crux of the story here. And indeed, she hears him say that the whole time, and she says, well, if you're going to be that adamant about it, okay, I'm going to get married to you. And then he's shocked, like, what? She's going to marry me? So how did we get that presented in the 80s anime? Quite interesting, because as I said, they started using some attributes or some tools. Well, he uses a tool like a pistol with a rope and a suction cup, and he uses that to pull off her bra. So he doesn't use his hands, he does it using that suction cup. So that's also a difference, and of course only now does he remove the bra, whereas in the manga that happened earlier. And then we see the scene where they're sitting together there, where the misunderstanding happens, and that Lum says, okay, I'm going to marry you. Relatively faithful to the manga, I have to say. Now, in the remake, what do we get there? Same scene, except here he pulls off the bra much more closely in the same way as it happened in the manga, except here in the anime it happened later. But he uses his hands, he doesn't use any tools. The same turn of event happens, but in between, Lum gets really upset and blasts him with her lightning. Her lightning wasn't introduced in the manga yet here. That gets introduced in a later story. Of course, the animators here know she has that ability, so they used it here. But that's a little bit of a difference here, because they use that ability here, whereas in the manga, she uses it for the first time later. And then the misunderstanding happens here as well. A little bit different than in the manga. They're not sitting down. They're standing atop a stage because he's the victor. They're announcing him as the victor. And here the whole misunderstanding unfolds as it unfolded in the manga. So all things considered, again, each anime has his or her own take on the turn of events. But I have to say, if I have to choose, perhaps the remake is a little bit more faithful. And I was very surprised to come to that conclusion. I absolutely didn't expect it. But for the first story part in the manga, I have to say maybe, yeah, the remake was a little bit closer. Doesn't take away the fact that the 80s anime is still great, of course. I mean, I still love it. But yeah, in my mind, I had a different recollection of the turn of events, I guess. And it's weird because sometimes your mind plays tricks on you. You've seen something a long time ago, and it has been a long time since I've seen the 80s anime. You seem to remember things in a certain way, when in fact, actually, if you look closely and if you start to dissect it, yeah, actually I have to come to the conclusion that the remake seems to be a little bit more closer to the original manga. I'm going to do another chapter, just for good measure. Here we have Yasashi Akuma, the kind devil. And that is actually a little bit of an intermezzo story. Here we don't see Lum at all. So the competition is done, and now we're continuing the story with Ataru, Shinobu, and Ataru's family, and Cherry as well. And there's no Lum involved, and she's obviously not living with him yet. So what happens here is at midnight, of course, Ataru, being the big attractor of bad luck, looks into a mirror exactly at 12 o'clock at night. A demon appears and jumps out of the mirror, and because Cherry tries to intervene, he can't get back into the mirror, which is his dimension. So the demon is stuck there. That's why the title, where the title comes from, Yasashi Akuma, the kind demon. Because as it turns out, he's a demon, but he's actually rather of the kind variety. The next morning, Shinobu arrives holding a big watermelon, which is typical in summer. Japanese tend to often enjoy watermelon then, because it's very refreshing, and since those are really big, they often share it with the whole family. So Shinobu arrives with the watermelon, and yeah, she sees the devil there. He's holding a knife, and then you have a whole scene where he really wants a piece of that watermelon, constantly attacking Ataru's mom in the kitchen, trying to get a piece of that melon. We have that story in the 80s anime, but very interestingly, in episode 6, way later than it should happen. And because it happens in episode 6, because they shuffle the stories around, in the meantime, we have had the story where Lum moves in with Ataru. So Lum is there. And we didn't have that in the manga. So that's an interesting difference there. And that's why, instead of Ataru and Cherry, because Cherry stayed there in the manga to protect Ataru from his bad luck. So here it's different. We don't have Cherry in the room, but we have Lum instead. And she comes out of the cupboard where she's actually staying, and then you have the whole thing with the demon as well. And in the anime version, the demon is a little bit of, I would say, a womanizer or crazy of women. He constantly tries to grab hold of Lum. She gets really fed up with that, flies out of the window to her spaceship, and then is lying there on the tiger sheet, upset that she can't be with Ataru because of that demon. Ataru, on the other hand, says, well, thanks, now I have a little bit of time for myself, thanks to you. And then the next morning, we also have Shinobu visiting, but she doesn't have the watermelon as she did in the manga. So far in the remake, we didn't get that story yet, but who knows, maybe they're gonna put it in later, I don't know. Moving on with this story, then next up we have the whole thing in the manga with the demon terrorizing almost the women there. He's trying to grab hold of Shinobu. We have Ataru putting him down, holding him down. Cherry is there, and he says, "What's going on?" And he says, "Yeah, he's constantly trying to grab hold of Shinobu." Eventually Shinobu even shows a little bit of compassion for him, and then Cherry comes up with a solution. He's going to use some kind of special Buddhist incantation which is going to open the portal in the Mirrorverse, if I can call it that, and the demon can go back to his own dimension. But of course, this being Urusei Yatsura and this being Ataru with his bad luck, what happens instead, they get a multiplication factor and the whole place is filled with these little demons. So that's the end of the story. Still, that doesn't happen in the remake. In the original 80s anime, what do we get there? So here we also have the scene with the demon grabbing hold of Shinobu and Ataru trying to pull him off. And a big difference, because Cherry isn't there yet, isn't involved yet, a big difference here is that both men at the household of Ataru are fed up with that demon. The ladies, so Ataru's mom and Shinobu, feel sorry for the demon because he's locked out of his dimension, he's all alone and so on. But he really gets on the nerves of the two men, and they meet up with Cherry at a restaurant, asking him if he can do something about their situation. It's at that time that Cherry arrives, or the day after that, he goes to Ataru's house, also dressed in a little bit more of special or festive clothing as he did in the manga. And he does the same incantation. As you can see, it's a very faithful reproduction here. And the result, of course, is the same. They're stuck with a whole bunch of those demons due to them multiplying. So a relatively faithful adaptation, except for one important fact. Since the episodes, the stories are out of order, that forces the animators to make certain changes, such as Lum being present there instead of Cherry. So I find that very interesting, and I've noticed as I've started dissecting these stories that this happens more often than not in the 80s anime, where they reshuffled some stories. Now, I'm wondering, the remake is still ongoing, is still being aired. I'm kind of wondering if they are going to continue in that same vein with the remake, but taking into account how many cours have been ordered so far, I would be inclined to think that they're not going to have enough time to cover all the stories with the remake. A problem they didn't have with the 80s anime. So if I were to venture a guess, and if I'm wrong, you can all come back here to the channel and have a good laugh at me. But if I would have to venture a guess, I would say that they're probably going to cut out certain stories or chapters from the manga that can be cut. And this is typically a story that you can cut. Why? Well, everything ends because in the next chapter in the manga, those demons are gone, they don't stay there. You end with the status quo. The situation at the start of the chapter is the same as it's going to be at the end of the chapter. Nothing meaningful happens. It's more of a standalone story. So that is perfect to be cut. So my guess is in the remake, they're not going to use or reproduce this story. They're just going to cut it so they can immediately move on to Lum moving in. And they're not going to come back to it anymore, in my opinion, because they're going to run out of episodes, they're going to run out of time, and I think they're just going to skip it altogether. I could be wrong, we'll see, but it's interesting to see the difference between the two adaptations. So with that, I haven't even covered the entirety of the first remade episode and the first episode of the 80s anime, but I wanted to stick to following the manga as the main thread, because that's the original story, to make these comparisons. And if you're interested in this, if you find this interesting, if you find this useful, if you want to hear more about this or see more breakdowns like this, I can continue and I can make a couple more videos and compare the manga, the 80s anime and the remake with the next chapters, so we can dig a little bit deeper and see exactly which changes have been made. But so far, I have to say, as I stated, yeah, the remake seems to be a little bit more faithful, in my opinion, aside from the fact that maybe they're going to have to skip certain chapters. But I think they did a great job, and it clearly shows, and I find that very interesting to note, that they didn't went back to the 80s anime, but they went back instead to the original manga, the original story. And I think that's a great decision by the people who made the anime. Go back to the source material, go back to the original story, and start from there, make your own version of that story. And I think they did a great job. They were very faithful, they were very respectful of the original work. And I appreciate that. I must say, I really appreciate that, because this is a classic. Urusei Yatsura is a classic. The remake is not gonna replace the 80s anime. The 80s anime is still gonna have its place in the zeitgeist, is still gonna have its place among anime and manga fans, especially the ones from my generation who have seen the original back in the 80s. But I think the remake, if they continue the way they're doing it now, I think the remake is going to have its own place as well, as a different kind of adaptation, a newer adaptation, and perhaps in certain places a little bit more faithful to the manga adaptation, which is great, I think. So yeah, surprising conclusion. I wasn't expecting to come to this. I thought I was going to be able to tell you that the 80s anime was the begin all end all, the most faithful, the best adaptation possible of the manga, and that the remake was just better animation techniques and that's it. But if I start to break it down, yeah, I have to admit, so far that is, that the remake actually did a very good job of staying faithful to the original story. So I hope you enjoyed my analysis. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown. Please do keep watching the channel if you enjoy my commentaries, my reviews, my analysis. If you're interested in this, please leave a like. It really helps the channel. Leave a like, share the video. You're welcome to share it everywhere on social media if you want to. And please do subscribe so you keep informed, so you keep getting my new videos into your feed. Because if you like this, please let me know. I can continue. I can break down a couple more chapters so we can have maybe a more comprehensive comparison between the 80s anime and the remake. I think this is very interesting. I hope you enjoyed it as well. And keep watching anime. Enjoy your anime and manga. And catch you guys at the next one. Ciao! Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, tap the notification bell and sound off in the comments. And hey, while you're here, why not check out another video?